Hello again, everyone. Nice to see you again. I'm not seeing you, but you're seeing me. I will be seeing you next week when we discuss this lecture. And as you might recall, last week we were talking about power, different sources of power, ways that it is exercised, power, and, and working together as part of the resistance to the regime. And today is really the practical strategies that we can use to actually the regime. So the lecture is on non-violent action, strategies for transforming power in Burma. So this will be building on social movement theory, non-violent resistance, and an area of scholarship that has really increased a lot in the last 10 years, partially because non-violent movements are really growing around the world. And we will cover a few different topics, a few different frameworks, and we'll be moving from our scholar mode, our academic way of understanding the literature and thinking about the ideas and evidence, to moving to more of an activist kind of role or mindset, where we are actually looking at practical strategies that we can use in the resistance movement to try to achieve our goals together over the next months and years. So I think that it's important that you all recognize that scholars have an important role in a non-violent movement for change. And sometimes that role is to bring the voice of history, or bring international examples, bring evidence to bear on how the movement is thinking and acting and what strategies it has. So today we will be exercising those muscles of informing ourselves, educating ourselves about nonviolent resistance. Sometimes it's called different things: civic resistance, nonviolent movements, nonviolent actions, nonviolent conflict. But we will be educating ourselves about these movements, both around the world and in Burma. And as I said, looking at some practical tools that we can use. So what is nonviolent action? Sometimes called civic resistance or nonviolent conflict. Well, it refers to quite a wide range of types of activities: protests, civil disobedience, economic boycotts, political non-cooperation, that are not violent. I underline that because that's something that we will talk about, the difference between violent action and non-violent in terms of its consequences. And it's when groups are refusing to do things, that's called acts of omission, or they're doing something new, acts of commission. And they are, in doing so, opposing a regime, opposing power holders, opposing a government, opposing a system, can be cultural or political, social, that they believe is unjust, that is violating the rights of people, the interests of everyday people. And sometimes they're going against the law. That's the idea of civil disobedience. And it's a very diverse set of types of actions that have taken different forms in different places throughout time. So the first task that we have today is to learn from history. So we're using an approach called appreciative at what has succeeded previously, or why things have failed and why, so that we can small of nonviolent resistance in Burma. So what are some examples of nonviolent movements that can help us understand what we're really talking about? Some of these you will be quite familiar with, and some of them less so, perhaps. So there's a long history of nonviolent resistance going back hundreds or thousands of years. People have been mobilizing against leadership or authority that they feel is unjust. But well-known examples from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the civil rights movement in the United States, which is the bottom famous leader of the there were numerous leaders. And the goal of that movement was civil rights for African American people. The other example there, Mahatma Gandhi, famous civil disobedience movement in India. And the goal of that movement was different again, trying to end English colonization, colonial rule in India. In the 1980s, you see the 1988 uprising in Burma that you're familiar with. The image below that is Tiananmen Square, protests and crackdown by the Chinese state. And then another wave, if you will, of nonviolent resistance movements arose in the 2010s, the so-called Arab Spring. Some of those were successful, like the top example in Egypt and also in Tunisia, although success and failure are maybe too simple terms because the struggle often changes or continues. And then the picture below is in Bahrain, which was not a example of a nonviolent movement in which the protesters were able to achieve their goals. In the modern era, we see different examples here. So the Extinction Rebellion movement is a current movement which is very strong in the United Kingdom, but it's happening around the world. And this is a response to the climate emergency, climate change issues. Below that, you have the example of Sudan. So in 2018 and 19, long-term protest movement was successful in ousting the government of Omar al-Bashir, who had been a dictator for decades, I believe. Now, since last year, that transitional government ended up fighting against some adversaries in the military, and so the country's actually in a very bad conflict state right now. So what can we learn about all of these examples? Well, they have different goals, these social movements. Some have clear political goals, in the case of India, and in the Arab Spring, where people were trying to overthrow governments and rulers. And some of these examples are happening in the context of violent state repression, and some aren't, which creates different conditions and risks for people involved. So obviously in Burma, there's a risk of violence being used by the military against protesters. They're also distinct in which methods they use. We'll go into those methods in a moment. They have longer durations. Some of them were quite short-lived and spontaneous. They arose quickly from some event that triggered them. Some of them were struggles that lasted over decades, or still continue, but they often go in cycles. You know, the movement may win victories, but then there might actually be some backsliding or change, And the struggle goes on, and I think we see that in Burma with different cycles. So there's of scholarship that has emerged in the last 15 years in relation to uh, nonviolent resistance or nonviolent action movements. And one quite prominent scholar in this field is someone called Erica Chenoweth at Harvard University, who I'll refer to a few times in this presentation. And she's charted the increasing number of nonviolent movements and mass campaigns, as opposed to violent strategies, which involve political violence or organized battles against material. So the number of violent movements has remained relatively similar since the 1900s, although showed a decrease in the last 20 years or so, whereas nonviolent movements have really been increasing slowly and then quite quickly since the 1980s. So in the last 40 years or so. My maths is not so good. And she gives a few hypotheses for this, which she doesn't present the evidence in the study, but others are looking into this. But one hypothesis for why we're seeing this increase in nonviolent movements is that all around the world, people within states have a better sense that nonviolent resistance is legitimate and can be quite successful. And modern communication technologies have provided the opportunity both for mobilization, and that was a key feature of the Arab Spring, for example, the newfound ability to mobilize. It has had implications in Burma too, but also people can gain access to methodologies and tools for organizing. They can learn about it. They can draw upon the experience of others, as we are doing today, and that's improved the strategies that people are using. The second point is more about awareness of the issues that nonviolent movements are trying to respond to. As we'll see in this lecture, public awareness is a critical factor of trying to challenge power holders, of trying to build power with and challenge the dominating power over of power holders in a country. So as people gain more access to information and better information and awareness of the issues, and nonviolent movements can use internet and other communication channels to raise awareness, that has led to movements proliferating, increasing in number. Since the end of the Cold War, the market for violence has dried up. So the United States and its allies and the USSR and its allies used to provide a lot more weaponry to its proxy forces, and it contributed and supported a market of violence that has not been available in the last 30 years or so, although I think maybe that pattern is shifting a little bit. And number 4 is more about the evolution of people's awareness of international human rights, their expectations that their rights will be upheld, and that they do not have to be subject to direct and structural violence. And people are responding to that and demanding better lives and better governance. Unfortunately, the 5th reason that she gives is that there has been an authoritarian turn in the world in the last 10 to 20 years. And so there's more repression, and people are fighting back against that. So that is another reason that might explain why more nonviolent movements are emerging. So for all of you dedicated researchers, I just wanted to draw your attention to this database, which if you want to understand more about specific cases of nonviolent movements, their successes, their failures, their on the right here, I have looked at, they have 1,200 cases, and I've just selected the cases that are, their goal is regime change, because I think that's what we are interested in Burma, or what the nonviolent movement, CDM, etc., is looking at doing. And so maybe it would be interesting to look at some of those examples. One thing that I note that we need to do is define maybe what the movement is in Burma. And one of the characteristics about Burma, which is not completely unique, but it's certainly relevant, is element. So perhaps something that we can do on our conversation, characterize the movement for the different parts that it has. So there's different entities like CDMers, strike committees, EROs, NUG, PDFs, and more. And then there's different strategies that the movement is using: boycotts, political non-cooperation, strikes, silent protests, and many more. So before we talk about those types of strategies or types of actions that nonviolent movements use, I want to bring your attention to a study that has been critical in the evolution of the literature, because it describes why it is useful, if you're interested in social change, political change within a state, why are nonviolent strategies useful? So I mentioned that Erica Chenoweth, will reference her work a few times, and this study, 2011, was pivotal. I think she looked at 130 cases between 1900 and 2006, and a pretty rigorous methodology to compare them. And the finding was quite surprising for them and for other scholars. The finding was that nonviolent resistance was nearly twice as likely to achieve the goals of the movement than violent counterparts. So what are we comparing to? We're comparing to civil war struggles, armed resistance movements. So what this evidence is saying, and there's been a lot of subsequent research which has backed this up, is that as a strategy for liberation, as a strategy for self-determination, or a strategy to meet the interests of people in an unjust state, non-violence works almost twice as well as taking up arms. Now, obviously, it's going to depend on the individual characteristics of each country in which it's happening. And Burma has its own set of characteristics. And my role here is not to argue for non-violence or say that violence can't be used. I think there are particular reasons why it has been historically in Burma, and why it's a part of the puzzle now. But I think that we should just be aware from the literature perspective of the implications of having violent strategies within a broader resistance movement. Okay, with that caveat aside, some features that they identified in this research of successful movements: large, diverse, and sustained participation. So we'll come back to that. What's the threshold? What's the amount of public awareness and public involvement that is typically needed to achieve success? The second one, I think, is critical in Burma, and I think we should really talk about this, which is the need to elicit shifts in the loyalty of the security forces and other elites. Strategies working that are encouraging defection, because there are strategies that are being used by some resistance actors. At what level do we more defection? How do we target that? What about the police? How is a defection strategy with the police being pursued? And then if we look at other elites, sometimes in the literature, these are referred to as the pillars that hold up the regime. So in Burma, there's also cronies and a range of economic elites that have historically, them and their families and networks have benefited a lot from their relationships with the regime. How can they be encouraged to tacitly or directly the regime? How can their support be undermined and apply to other pillars that hold the regime up? Be geopolitical relationships, like relationships with China politically and economically. Might be political relationships with ASEAN. There might be other regional relationships, might be military relationships. How can they be undermined, and through who might the resistance actually leverage that strategy? A third finding that they found in this research was that there needs to be more than just protests. And one of the features that we'll look at in the evolution of Burma's nonviolent resistance is that the range of methods that have been employed has really grown. So that's a good sign. The fourth point speaks to the violence, which we'll come back to. And what they found was that when the movements take on violence, the same kind of instrument of power that their adversary uses, that it could weaken the movement and that it has some negative consequences for the ability of the movement to achieve its goals. And we'll look at that in more depth. So I wanted to invite you with this little pause symbol to just have a think about some of these features of successful movements from your own understanding of the resistance in Burma. So particularly, how do you maximize participation in the movement, public participation? How and whose loyalty to the regime needs to be influenced and challenged? How would you do that? And maybe the violence question we can come back to, as we are now. So the reasons why a movement that is sometimes movements are provoked into becoming violent. So you can imagine if protesters are opposing a construction of a hydropower dam, for instance, and the police start hitting them with batons or spraying them with tear gas, sometimes people start fighting back, right? They're provoked. At other times, the use of violence is already a part of the resistance, and that's the case in Burma, where there has been armed resistance since the 1947, I believe. The Korean, I believe, were the first. And so from that perspective, the use of violence is a potential that's already there, already happening. And sometimes it's, coordinated part of a broader resistance strategy, which is the case in Burma, although it hasn't always been. And sometimes it's not coordinated. It's just happening sporadically. But the implications of that, one needs to see nonviolent resistance and the main legitimacy and power that a social movement has to change an unjust authoritarian state is by setting itself apart from no longer put it domestically, internationally, a message that something that is fairer, more just, and different than the bad guys. So that can undermine the movement's credibility. And if you think that right now there are decision makers in Washington, D.C., in Geneva, in Brussels, in Beijing, that are watching the resistance, and they're trying to decide what might a future Burma look like if it was led by the resistance. They observe the violence of both sides, and it can bring into question whether or not the resistance is a good actor. So that's something to be aware of. Similarly, it's hard to discredit your opponent for their brutality, and the junta is undeniably a very brutal regime, but it becomes harder to discredit that and expose that and mobilize coalitions to act against that brutality if the movement itself uses violence. It can also just scare people from participating because it tends to create escalation. So I want to make it really clear that I'm not saying that that in Burma there's no place for violence, for defense of communities. There's no reason to fight back. I have the privilege of not being under threat myself, like many of you are, and many people in Burma are. And were I in that situation, I can't say what I would or wouldn't do. So I'm not here to I don't take any moral stand on the use of violence. I'm just pointing out what the literature says. Okay. So, an excellent book that I recommend to you if you want to improve the strategies available to the resistance to create the change that you want in Burma is a book by someone called Gene Sharp called The Politics of Nonviolent Action. Came out in 1973. It's quite old, still very relevant. And what he did in this book is he classified 198 types of nonviolent action, 198 different methodologies, and he categorized them into economic and political and social and other categories. But the reason why I feel like it's so useful and interesting is that when you look at these different types of nonviolent strategies. You can see a lot that you're already using, and you can consider a lot that you aren't using, and that might suit the goals that you're trying to achieve, the different actors that you're trying to influence, the resources that you do have available to you, the safety considerations that you do have. So I just wanted to mention a few of these, the ones that I've boxed here. The first one on the top left, boxed in green, it refers to protests and persuasion. And I wanted to emphasize this because I want to make the point as clearly as possible that non-violent movements work by influencing hearts and minds, by raising public awareness, and by winning over the public to the side of the resistance so that they will join the movement, resist the unjust power. And so there's various ways to do that, and many of them have been used in Burma. It might be collective statements that are made by resistance actors. It might be social media campaigns. It might be symbolic acts. I've heard the example at the beginning of the Spring Revolution, at least, where women's lunges were being put over power lines in the streets in Yangon and maybe other places. This is a powerful symbolic act that communicates to not advance lungi, but also it's a form of social protest to display like rejection of that social norm that is unfairly disempowering women's role in society. So there's a lot of different ways that you can communicate. One of our challenges, I think, for the movement is how do we communicate at scale so that we can reach a lot of the domestic audience so that they understand and come over to see the resistance perspective on a range of issues, and also how do we do that outside of the country? And we will come back to that. Drama and music, I wanted to emphasize this is in the red small box on the left side, because I think Myanmar people are very creative and have a very rich culture when it comes to drama and communicating in that way. I remember the mustache if I saw them or heard of them, but they were former political prisoners and they did a comedy show in Mandalay. I don't know how they got away with it or how long they got away with it, but they, in a light-hearted way, were able to communicate with many international tourists that would come through what the oppression that was experienced was like for people. A very creative way. In the next column, I put in a box there, economic non-cooperation. So economic boycotts, refusing to buy things. So I think it's Myanmar Beer is owned by the military holding company UMEHL, right? So an example of exercising your power to resist the military would be not drinking Myanmar beer or buying any products that provide revenue for the military, or it could be also for the cronies. These are the economic elites that you might want to undermine. You might want to influence them by saying, we're going to boycott all of your products unless you come over to our side. But there's other types of economic non-cooperation if you go further down that column, like strikes, and that's being employed in Burma. There are strikes of many different types that you can see there. On the further down on the third column there, political non-cooperation. So the civil disobedience movement, the public officials, doctors, nurses, teachers, refusing to continue in their roles is a form of political non-cooperation. It might also be boycotting participation in a legislature like a luto, or it might be boycotting elections. Again, there's many different types of tactics that are used. In individual cases, what's sometimes called psychological intervention, things like hunger strikes that prisoners would take, and many other forms, sit-ins where you go and you occupy a space, very many different types of tactics. So again, these are useful for members of the movement that are developing a strategy to review all these different tactics and to see if there might be other tools that we could be applying in Burma. Okay, I just wanted to define civil disobedience because it is a term that you hear commonly with the CDM, and it is a feature. It's a strategy or a set of strategies within a much larger range of strategies for nonviolent action. So civil disobedience applies in the case when there is a violation of a law for a social purpose. So looking at the activation of the conscription law, for example, as recently took place, to evade conscription, to refuse to be conscripted would be an act of civil disobedience, as it is in just not evading your role. There are various types of civil disobedience involving laws of the country or just expected practices. Okay. So we've talked a lot about what are nonviolent actions, strategies, what is a nonviolent movement, how does it compare to violent strategies, what different types of actions are involved. Now we want to look at their how movements can evolve over time. It's quite typical that movements take a long time to achieve their roles and go through different cycles, and involve different roles for different types of people or organizations within that movement. The image that you're seeing here, this diagram, comes from a book called The Movement Action Plan from someone called Bill Moyer. It's also reasonably old, but still very, very relevant. And what you see here, numbered 1 to 8, are different stages in the evolution of a movement towards its goals, whether that be overthrowing a regime or changing a social norms related to gender or anything else, or environmental action, or any other example. And what it shows us is that there's a general pattern that gets followed that relates to the degree of public awareness about the issues and the capacity for some people within a society to organize or mobilize that awareness, or mobilize people to act and take action to change the status of those issues, and going through different periods of success and failure and setbacks towards a stage where there are reformers in the system that actually can work through the institutions to overcome their resistance to changing in that way. So what you can see here are four different roles: reformers, rebels, public, and organizers. You can tell me who you think that you are. But what often happens first is that there's a trigger event which activates mobilization around these issues. And that's been a key feature of Burma's history, these trigger events, the last one being the 2021 military coup. And rebels are the people that are at the vanguard of response to that are leading the protests out in the street, that are taking risks, and play a very important role early on to raise public awareness around the issues. And it's not just, to use the example of the 2021 coup, there's a range of issues that are emerging from that. It's not just that the elected government was thrown out, but that all of the democratic progress that had been made was at risk: the people's right to vote, the human rights protections, the martial law was coming in, imprisonment, possibilities for people. All of these issues were awareness getting raised around those. Now, the green line is showing the public awareness of the issues raising over time. It's raising in response to people being directly affected, and also because of what the public discourse is around those issues. And that's why controlling the narrative is a very important aspect of what the movement needs to do. Gradually increasing over time, you see organizers playing an increasing role. And in a moment, we'll talk about exactly what that is. And reformers really coming in later on. So reformers, as we'll see, are in places where they're working formally through institutions to create the change. To there, I'd be curious to hear where you think the move. A feature of this model introduced the idea of activist failure, so stage 5, to reflect that often movements have an initial surge, win some quick victories, and then feel like they're not making progress anymore, and that's accompanied by a sense of failure, and people can lose hope. But while that's happening, public awareness is still increasing around the issues. Some of the elite support for the regime is still getting challenged. Organizers are having more roles, reformers starting to act in places not always visible. So then you can be moving into that 6th stage and not really know about it. That 6th stage is when, according to this model, more than 50% of the public is supportive of the issues that the resistance movement is pushing for and willing to side with them. That, according to this model, is the moment in which you're moving into a different phase that might end or lead to you achieving the goals that you're looking for. And I think that moment might be quite close in Burma. So different roles that were in that model. The rebel, we talked about being the risk takers that are leading the protests, getting out there in the streets. in this one, they call it citizen. That's the public. That's the general public person who needs to be aware of the issues. Often represents the silent majority. Doesn't want to see extreme actions by the movement. Is concerned about radical uses of violence, etc. The change agent, which had a different name, and the other one as the organizers. So these are the people that are networking, often civil society, that are organizing things like strikes and protests and decision-making forums, committees, networking. And the reformers are the people that are using official channels to stabilize change, changing laws, etc. It's a bit more challenging to understand in Burma because there's a parallel system in which we have reformers that are very active in NUG, NUCC on the resistance side, trying to establish alternative institutions. And it's my understanding, although I don't know as closely anymore, but working within the institutions inside Burma might be much more difficult to try to reform them because of the conditions in the post-coup environment. Okay, so what can we learn from the experience, Burma's experience of non-violent and violent resistance to the Tatmadaw, to the regime, and all its cronies and all of the bad stuff that's gone along with that? Well, I have not done a full literature review, so I'm going to present the findings of a brief literature review, and I hope that this is another topic that we can talk about. But this famous study that I've been referencing by Chenoweth and Stefan in 2011 that really set the foundation for understanding why nonviolent resistance was so effective, used Burma as one of its case studies, as one of the unsuccessful examples of change, I'm sorry to say. And the reasons that it gave for that failure in Burma compared to more successful examples was a failure to change the loyalty of the security apparatus. So the failure to that the violence that accompanied the non-violent protests of 1998 were not successful. I think actually a number of EAOs lost territory around about that time, if I'm not mistaken. And the evidence also suggested that international sanctions were not effective against the Burmese regime. I think that's probably been quite true throughout the history of the use of sanctions in Burma. But they didn't create a high enough political cost for the regime for what they were doing. And with respect to sanctions, they could easily go around them and secure what they needed to from China or India. So they weren't really affected by that. Also, the mobilization in 88, according to this analysis, was not necessarily broad-based. It was relatively urban, student-led, some sectors of society, but not all or most sectors of society. So you can tell me if you agree with that. But it was linked to leaders, particular leaders like Aung San Suu Kyi. Now, the Saffron Revolution was, short-lived and in some ways smaller. But according to the analyses that I looked at, suffered from being quite fragmented, and not having the regime was quite easily able to suppress that at that time in 2007. Then looking at the Spring Revolution, where we are now, yeah, I read a few articles, and I don't know how convinced I was by what they're saying, so I'd be curious to hear what you think. The first point of a stronger collective identity, that really matches my own research. So I'm still doing my doctoral research on Burma, and part of what I look at is how different groups, different ethnic groups, different people from different parts of the country, how they understand what goals or nationhood they're wanting to create, and how that's changed over time. And in the post-coup environment, it definitely seems like there's a lot more understanding of the suffering of others, long-term and recent, and more coherence in what the goal of resistance is. And that might be talked about as federal democracy, or it might be talked about as overthrowing the regime. But there's more coherence that the regime needs to go. The second one also seems to match my understanding, with respect that the movement is very creative and quite diverse in its tactics. It's remarkable what the movement has done since 2021 with respect to strikes, boycotts of various times, civil disobedience strategies, protests, political dialogue, creation of new political instruments, international advocacy, appeals to international bodies, criminal courts, etc. The range of tactics, and the skills that exist within the movement to mediate, facilitate, try and maintain or build unity is really impressive and seems quite different than before. Another finding is that the public awareness of the issues, the military's role in creating those issues, and the possible alternative, the rights that people have around democracy and other human rights, that has increased. And there's certainly a different information environment than there was in 2007 or 88, in which people can become aware, and that internationally also with the diaspora, how communication can happen. So there's a opportunity for much greater participation that is not just certain subsectors of can be broad. Can see in a number of ways the cracks in the regime that are significant. I didn't have economic data, and I to the economic elite side of this, but I know that rates of defection are certainly much higher than anything that I've seen in the time that I've been observing Roma, and that just since Operation 1088, the like regularity with which the regime is losing military battles is unlike anything I think we've seen before, and that is a real pillar of their strength. Hence why they've brought in the conscription law. Another finding that is that the tactics of the resistance legitimize violence in ways that undermine its credibility. So examples given were threats of violence against public officials if they don't join the civil disobedience movement, threats of execution, the gender-based violence that is rife in the PDFs, as well as the broader use of violence by direct violence by PDFs and EROs. These are threats to the credibility of the movement, though again, they have a certain logic to them as well, and I'm not here to judge that. So when you put this all together, what does it tell you in terms of where we are now with the strengths and weaknesses and opportunity for the movement to achieve its goals? I feel that it's much better than in the past, and there are successes to look at. None of it means that the goals of the movement are about to be met now, or that it's in any way guaranteed. But there are different characteristics of the Spring Revolution that have not been there before. So turning to the last part of the lecture, which is really trying to get practical about, okay, so how can we as scholars that also might play activist roles or play organizing roles or play change maker roles in this process of nonviolent action, how can we support the movement to have better strategies and potential to achieve its goals? And I'm going to focus on analytical tools, advocacy strategies to win hearts and minds and be clear about who needs to be influenced, how they will be, how might the regime be further undermined. I won't have time to say too much about unity building, but I will say a bit about how to keep safe. It's a characteristic of Burma more so than most other contexts that being part of the movement implies a lot of risk. So safety is important. So just going back to this Bill Moyer's movement action plan and the different stages that have characterized hundreds of movements and how they have evolved over time. And I asked you, where do you think the movement in Burma is now, the resistance? I wanted to just speak a little bit to the stage of activist failure and how to get through that, because my sense is that in working with you all and with a lot of other people that have been engaged in the work since 2021, it has a huge toll on people, and that is a source of a lot of sadness and hopelessness and frustration and anger, and that is completely understandable given what you've been through. It's also commonly happens to other people facing this. I think in Burma, it might feel even worse because it feels like the outside world is not listening. So it is undoubtedly difficult. So some of the signs of this so-called activist failure might be familiar to you. It's not getting the media attention that it used to. It used to be very active, and protests and achievements and federal new mechanisms, and then things can stagnate. People associate this stage with a lot of negative feelings and mental health challenges. Depression is common. Unfortunately, things like suicide become more common. And that's all of these negative feelings really challenge people. The movement gets put under pressure because it doesn't feel like it's achieving its goals, and so some parts of the movement might radicalize or become uncoordinated from shared goals and start taking actions that undermine the individuals might take action. So these are common patterns, and there are response, getting stagnated or like we haven't been successful. It's helpful just to look back and recognize the successes that have taken place. And that could be politically, could agreements that have been made, firsts that have been achieved, groups who have been recognized formally that they haven't been recognized before, the levels of cooperation between groups that haven't been there before, territorial gains that are unprecedented, new alliances, educational initiatives or capacities that are there and enabling learners in different ways. Sometimes we're not as mindful of our successes because we're so focused on what still needs to change. We can also sort of revisit the central strategy of what the movement is trying to do, which is winning hearts and minds of the public. So we can take stock of where we are in terms of how well do we think the general public is aware of the issues that we're trying to change, and what percentage of the population sympathizes with the goals that we're trying to achieve. Now, according to the research, when that level rises over 50%, we know that we are moving along towards conditions that we can really start to undermine the regime or undermine what we're trying to change. So sometimes having that sense of knowing how much of the public is behind you can give you some renewed confidence that you're actually on the right track. There is no guarantee that any movement will succeed, but if you have very low support versus very high, you actually have a better sense of how realistic it is. But this might be an opportunity when you're feeling frustrated to look at your strategy again. We're going to look at some tools to do that, see where the strategies that are ineffective and those that are working well, amplify what's working well, and discard what is not working. But above anything, I think that the stories that we hear from other movements is that people had to embrace the sense that this is really a long-term journey and that they're part of a really long-term process, and it will always go through bad times, but the work still needs to be done. So, I mean, these things are easy for me to say when I'm not sitting there with you. I understand that, but I'm just trying to draw some attention to what the literature says about this stage. Okay, so a lot of what I'm going to present now in terms of practical strategies comes from this resource, which is in Burmese that you can access using the link below. So it's a toolkit essentially for synergizing nonviolent action and peace building. It's just really talking about nonviolent action strategies and then peace building skills like facilitation and planning and dialogue, mediation, negotiation, and how they can be used as part of a collective movement. And that's a critical part of it, because a movement is only as powerful as the quality of its relationships and cooperation between members. And collective strategy. So if you look at this different chapters, so I wanted to draw your attention to are ways, methodologies that you can use in groups. It should be done in groups to try to understand the different actors in your landscape, in your movement, domestically that are opposing you, internationally that are allied to you or could be allied with you, because ultimately the success of your strategy is going to depend upon how well you can understand your relationships with different actors, understand what their interests are, influence them so that they provide resources to you or change their goals. So many people in the movement might already have used or be using these kind of tools. I'm just trying to bring some more to the attention of different people. This first one here is about understanding who's on your side, your allies, who you're opposed to clearly, and everything in between. So passive allies, middle, passive opponents. Now remember that you're trying to win over the general public. You're also trying to undermine the support for the regime of elites. So you would map specific stakeholders onto these categories using this tool, using a discussion between people, and then you would use that to come up with strategies for how you might communicate with them, form relationships, change your relationships, influence them, get resources from them, etc. Another tool to do that is this one is a power and interests mapping tool. So you might take those different actors that you have characterized, you place them on that scale, allies to opponents. And in this one, you're trying to understand who's the most powerful and who's the most interested in you. And that gives you a sense of how to prioritize your relationships. So in the top left, when they have high power or influence in terms of the goals that you have, and they have a low level of interest at the moment, there's something that you might need to do to actually bring them on board. So it might be the United States government, for example. They have a lot of potential power to influence the situation in Burma, but Burma is one of many foreign policy conversations and priorities in Washington, and it's not up the top. It's not at the bottom either, but it's what is sometimes called like a boutique issue. So there's a certain set of people around Washington that are interested in it, but it's not like as big as the war in Ukraine or Israel, Palestine, China. These things crowd it out. So how would you meet the needs of the US through an advocacy strategy? We will talk about how you might do that. This tool helps you first to understand like who the players are that you need to work with or not. This is another tool to kind of do that. You would use this domestically to understand, for example, in the movement, what's the quality of relationships between different groups, who has a conflicted relationship, who doesn't have a relationship, who has a strong relationship, who's in a formal alliance. This can help you with your relationship facilitation strategy. You might reach out to certain groups, try and understand their perspective better, try and bring them into your collective decision-making processes, try to change somehow your relationship with them based upon this kind of analysis. All of those tools are available in Burmese if you'd like to go ahead and use them. Now, having a better sense of who the actors are, you might develop more specific goals for what your movement's trying to achieve. Again, if we go back to the central focus on trying to win hearts and minds, we might be thinking about how is our movement communicating? Who is it communicating with? Are we influencing the public in the way that we want to? Are we undermining elite support for the regime? Over on the right-hand side is another set of questions that you can be asking yourself. this thing, you would be the kind of people that would sit down in a group with this resistance and have conversation about changing your strategy, about engaging with different actors, about trying to amplify your impact and your advocacy. These are the kind of questions that you might bring into that space to improve that conversation and improve your strategy. We can certainly talk about, one thing I'd like to think about is like actually when and how and with who would we use those tools. So maybe that's something we can discuss next week. One of the final points that I wanted to make is around advocacy strategy. And again, it's because, you know, one of the best weapons that is available to a non-violent to awareness around it, to present a narrative and to influence the actors that need to be influenced so that you can achieve your goals. So in the language of advocacy, it's called like knowing your advocacy targets. And we talked about already knowing who your allies are, who's in the middle, who's opposed to you, and from that understanding through those tools, who you need to influence and how. So domestically, you might be thinking about the general public. You might be thinking in more specific ways, like pillars of the regime, security forces, economic and political elites. Regionally, you might be thinking about influencing China or India or ASEAN. Internationally, you might be thinking about who in the international community, whether that's US government, EU, the United Nations. You need to get quite specific around which organizations and people and links that you have to in those organizations that you might want to try and influence. My experience, and I might be completely wrong with this, but has been that this is not a strength of Myanmar's movement, and getting issues onto the international agenda has been really challenging. I do believe that there is a case that can be made, and again, that I'll use the example of the United States for this. But first, we really need to understand the perspective of those policymakers internationally, or you could think about that with respect to all of your advocacy targets. You need to understand, if you're going to influence them, what are their decision-making criteria? What persuades them? What do they really care about? What are they responsive to? And it's not necessarily what they say with respect to human rights or anything else. There's often hidden interests. So we really need to do good research to understand what they think, and then craft our message so that it responds to what they can be influenced by. So I'll use the example of the United States. The United States has a long-running partnership with Burma, has been supporting Burmese civil society for a long time, puts a lot of resources into the country compared to other donors, and never, and post 2010, when the transition was underway, the peace process started, never really went all in behind the government and the transition like many of the other donors did. It sort of held back more, was more skeptical. Anyway, all of this to say that the US is an ally and could potentially do more, but it requires understanding how to make the issue more relevant or salient. And one potential example or way that you could do that is by try to leverage how competitive the US is with China, and provide the message that the resistance, that the junta has a close relationship with China and is supporting Chinese goals, and that a future resistance would be a close friend. At the same time, the resistance needs to give the impression to the US and much more broadly to the international community that it is a legitimate and stable governing alternative to the junta. ASEAN's and other regional partners' continuing tendency to prop up the regime is in part because they think, well, even if it's a brutal despotic regime, it's still relatively stable compared to what would happen if it wasn't there. And so the message needs to be that actually the regime is a threat to regional and international order. It's a criminal actor. It's brutally committing crimes against its own population. And here's how the resistance would provide a more stable and that story is important for you. And then it's a question of understanding what advocacy channels and resources do we have available to get those messages across. Resource goes into this in a lot more depth. It's been a lot today, so I want to thank you so much for your time. The last piece that I wanted to look at, or just draw your attention to the resources, are around safety, because engaging in nonviolent resistance in Burma comes with many risks, as you know. So here are some links to some tools and suggestions for how the movement can improve its safety practices. I wanted to talk a little bit about conscription, but we ran out of time to really do it in depth. I know that it's something that many of you are thinking about. We could talk more about it. Spain is a good example of a civil disobedience movement that succeeded in opposing subscription. There's no longer any mandatory military service in Spain, although it took about 20 years for that to be achieved. The story does, or example does, give some sense of the strategies that were used. Finally, I'd like to know how we maintain unity in the movement. It's a very big question and maybe too much for our discussion, but that's one of the parts that we haven't talked about, is how do we avoid fragmentation. I'm just noting that requires more than just good facilitation skills. Thank you very much for your time today. We will have a discussion in about a week from now. I'll send you some readings and also some questions, and I look forward to seeing you in just a few days' time.